The Sceptre of Annúminas had been on the table for 4 hours before anyone took it up. Elrond had placed it there himself, at the morning's first hour, before the council's other members had assembled, had carried it from the inner vault where it had rested for 1,000 years, and set it on the stone table's center without ceremony or comment, the way you set down an object whose purpose required no introduction. Then he had taken his own seat and said nothing about it, and the council had assembled around it and said nothing about it, and for 4 hours the discussion had proceeded. The ring's history, Sauron's return, the question of the Hobbit and what he carried and what that carrying meant for every free people in Middle-earth, while the scepter sat in the table's center and accumulated the specific weight of an unaddressed thing. Boromir had recognized it in the first minute. He had studied the histories. He was the son of a steward who had spent 20 years preparing Gondor for exactly this war, and Denethor's preparation had included the histories, the lineages, the artifacts, the specific material record of the House of Isildur's long maintenance of its claim. The Sceptre of Annúminas was described in 3 separate documents in Minas Tirith's archive: its dimensions, its device, the specific silver work along its upper third that the first craftsman of Arnor had executed in a style not used in the south. He knew what he was looking at. He had spent 4 hours not looking at it. The discussion reached its natural crisis in the afternoon's 3rd hour. He had made his argument. He had made it with the full force of everything Gondor had paid across 400 years of holding the south: the garrison at Osgiliath, the walls of Minas Tirith, the generations of soldiers who had died on the Pelinor's approaches and in the passes of Ithilien, and in every forward position Gondor had maintained, between the free peoples and the Eye's outright sovereignty. He had made the argument accurately. Every fact in it was true. Gondor had borne the weight. Gondor had held the line. And if the ring was power, if the thing the Hobbit carried was what the histories said it was, then that power should come to the people who had paid the price of its absence. He finished speaking. He was aware, even as he finished, that the argument had produced no conviction in the room. Not because the argument was wrong, but because the room had heard it and found it insufficient against something it had not yet said, and he had not yet seen fully named. Then the ranger stood. He had been aware of the ranger since morning. He had made his own assessment. The ranger had the look of the northern men who occasionally appeared in Gondor circles, the lean, competent quality of someone who had been living hard in difficult terrain for a long time. He had dismissed the assessment, after making it, the way you dismissed a variable whose relevance had not yet been established. He revised the assessment when the ranger stood, because the act of standing produced something in the room's atmosphere that the ranger's seated presence had not. He was taller than Boromir had registered, not dramatically, but in the precise way of a man whose height becomes apparent only when he is upright and occupying his full extent. He stood with the stillness of someone who was not in a hurry to do the thing he was about to do, because the thing did not require hurry. He walked to the table's center. He picked up the Sceptre of Annúminas with his right hand. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms went quiet when something that had been possible had become actual. Not a sudden quiet. The conversation had already been slowing, the discussion thinning in the last few minutes as various members of the council became aware that something was building toward a point. It was the quiet of a thing arriving that had been traveling for a long time. He held the scepter with the ease of someone who had held it before, or more precisely, with the ease of someone who had not held it before, but whose hand knew its weight from a knowledge that predated his own experience of it. His grip was not ceremonial. It was the grip of a man picking up something that belonged to him. He named himself. Boromir listened. The name came first: Aragorn, son of Arathorn. Then the names descended, chieftain to chieftain, back through the long line of the North's wandering leadership, each name a generation of men who had maintained a claim in silence and concealment across 1,000 years. Aranarth, Araglas, Arahad. The names continued until they reached Arvedui, last king of Arthedain, and then turned the corner into the older lineage, Arvedui to Isildur, and Isildur to Elendil, and Elendil to Númenor and the kings of the sea. He delivered this, not as a speech, not as a proclamation designed for the effect that such lineages produced when performed with the cadences of political theater. He delivered it the way you delivered a list of accurate facts to people capable of verifying them, in the order that the accuracy required, without inflection that instructed the listener how to receive each item. Boromir was verifying each item against the archive in his memory as the names came. Every name was correct. Every name was in the order the genealogical record required. Every name, verified against his 20 years of studying exactly these documents in the Minas Tirith archive, was precisely where it was supposed to be. He stood in the House of Elrond, with his 7 arguments assembled, and felt, with the specific clarity of a man whose mind was precise enough to recognize its own updating, each argument locate its new position. They were not wrong. They were simply not about the relevant question anymore. The relevant question had changed when the ranger had picked up the scepter, because the scepter's presence in a man's hand made a specific question relevant. Not should Gondor have the ring, but who is this man? And the answer to the relevant question was making its way through Boromir's assessment, with the inevitability of water finding the level it was always going to find. "The time of hiding is over," the man said. The scepter in his right hand, steady, not raised for display, simply held, the way authority was held when it did not need to demonstrate itself. "The shards of Narsil will be made whole before this column moves. Andúril, flame of the west, reborn from Narsil's shards, will be named tomorrow before this council's members and carried south in the open. I will not approach my enemy like a thief." The room received this. Boromir's 7 arguments occupied 7 specific positions in his mind, and he looked at them in turn, and understood that they had been constructed for a situation that no longer existed. They had been built for the situation of a world without a king, which was the world Gondor had been governing since the line of Anarion failed, and which Gondor's stewards had navigated with the specific competence of men who understood that the absence of a king did not mean the absence of everything the king had stood for. He had made those arguments well. He had made them in good faith. He had made them with the complete conviction of a man who had spent his entire life in a world where they were the right arguments. He was standing in a world where they were not. He went to one knee on the stone of Rivendell's council floor, not in surrender. He had spent enough time with soldiers to know the difference between the posture of a man submitting and the posture of a man recognizing what he had just seen. This was recognition. This was the specific, voluntary gesture of a man whose integrity was sufficient that when the truth of the world's actual structure became clear to him, he adjusted his position to match it rather than maintaining the position he had arrived with. The stone was cold under his knee. The air in the House of Elrond carried the specific mineral quality of a valley that had been inhabited by elves for 3,000 years. Old, deep, the smell of something that had been here before the current age and would be here after it. A hand came to rest on his shoulder, not heavy, not claiming. The hand of a man acknowledging the weight of what had just been given, and returning some of that weight in the specific form that only one kind of authority could return it. "Gondor's steward has governed well," said the voice above him. "The South has held, because the South had men worth holding it." Boromir looked up. He had spent 20 years navigating environments where praise was a transaction, where words that sounded like acknowledgement were instruments of debt, calibrated to create obligation in the receiver. He had become skilled at identifying the mechanism beneath the gift. He listened for it now, in the specific silence after those 2 sentences, and found nothing. No mechanism, no subsequent clause that would convert the acknowledgement into a claim on his loyalty. Simply the accurate statement of a thing that was true, delivered to a man who had done the thing and was being told that the doing had been seen. He had not expected relief. He had not known he was carrying something heavy enough to feel its absence. He felt its absence now. Halbarad had been timing things for 40 years. This was not a habit he had developed deliberately. It was what the work produced in a man who spent 4 decades coordinating a network of people scattered across 1,000 miles of wilderness, where the difference between a message arriving on schedule and arriving 3 days late was frequently the difference between an ambush working and 4 rangers dying in a ditch. He counted seconds during engagements. He counted hours between dispatch and response. He counted days between the last confirmed sighting of a given threat and the point at which that threat's absence became more alarming than its presence. He did this automatically now, the way breathing was automatic, his mind running the interval count below whatever conscious process was operating on the surface. He had been captain of the Rangers of the North for 40 years, and he had never assembled them all. He understood the network completely. He knew every cluster, the Sarn Valley Group, 14 fighters, the Weather Hills contingent, which operated in 3 rotating pairs across a 60-mile range, the hidden settlement above the last bridge that had been quietly building its population for 30 years under the chieftain's specific authorization. He knew their strengths and their losses and their current assignment, and the quality of their individual commanders. He had never seen them as a single force, because assembling them in a single force was not a thing that had been done in his lifetime, or his father's lifetime, or his father's father's lifetime. The message had gone out from Rivendell 17 days ago. He had been at Sarn Ford for 4 days. They came in groups. Not the clean, organized march of a military force assembling at a designated point. There was no tradition for that among the Rangers, whose instinct across a millennium of dispersed operation was to move quietly, in small numbers, at intervals designed to avoid presenting a trackable pattern to any surveillance that might be running. They arrived in 3s and 7s and 12s. Emerging from the tree line or the river's western approach, or the low ground south of the ford with the specific quality of movement of people who had been moving through this terrain their whole lives, and could stop being invisible only with conscious effort. He watched them come across 4 days, and he counted them. The Rangers proper, the core of the network, each of them a veteran of 40 to 80 years of continuous fieldwork, arrived in the first 2 days, 412. He had the right number in his records, but looking at the figure against the actual people it represented produced a different kind of knowing. He had coordinated 412 individual operational profiles. The profiles became men when you put them in a field together, and the men had weight and presence and the specific quality that 80 years of continuous lethal competence deposited in a person's bearing. The others came in the 2nd and 3rd days. The men of the Weather Hills, who carried Dunédain blood 2 and 3 generations back, and had been maintaining their relationship with the Ranger network under the specific understanding that the relationship was preparation for something. The Eriador-descended farmers and foresters of the Nen Sarn Valley, who had been training to a Ranger standard for 3 decades on Halbarad's own authority. The hidden settlement above the last bridge, 160 people, 60 of them fighters, the rest support capacity that the column would need. They arrived with their weapons maintained, and their packs already organized, and their faces carrying the expression of people who had been told this day was coming their whole lives, and had not been certain they believed it, until they were. Standing at Sarn Ford, watching it happen. By the end of the 3rd day, the count was 1,981. He found the remaining 19 on the 4th day's morning, arriving from 3 separate directions. The last of them, a woman from the Trollshaw's borderlands, who apologized for being late in the specific tone of someone who considered arriving on the 4th day of a 4-day assembly to be a professional failure. He did not disagree with her assessment, but he kept that between himself and his count. 2012, by the 4th day's mid-morning. He stood at the ford's eastern bank and looked west across the assembled force and ran the calculation that he had been running in the background since the 1st day, the count against the territory it represented, the capability against the years of work that had produced the capability, the scale of what was standing in a field at Sarn Ford, against the scale of what had been quietly maintained across 1,000 years of dispersal and loss, and the long patience of a people who had been told to wait, and had waited, and had kept, waiting past the point where waiting was comfortable. He did not find a word for what he was looking at that was adequate to what he was looking at. He stopped trying to find one. The column had a shape by the 4th day, not the disciplined formation of a force that had drilled together for years, but the organic geometry of 2,000 people who understood the work and had organized themselves into the configuration that the work required, without being told to. The Rangers formed the core, distributed through the column's length, in the proportion that their specific capabilities made optimal. The Eriador-descended fighters, arranged around them in the natural clustering of people who had been working with specific Ranger contacts for years, and understood the working relationship. The support elements at the column's rear, already running the logistics that 2,000 mouths and 2,000 bodies required. He had run a dispersed network for 40 years. He was looking at what the network became when it stopped being dispersed. Aragorn arrived at the 4th day's 2nd hour. From the northeast, he came with the sons of Elrond, Elladan, and Elrahir, who were known to Halbarad by reputation across 40 years and by brief operational contact on 6 occasions, each of which had left him with an updated estimate of what formidable meant in an Elvish warrior who had been fighting Sauron's servants for centuries, and 300 elves of Rivendell behind them, moving in the specific, unhurried formation of beings for whom the pace of the march required no effort. Andúril caught the light before Aragorn reached the ford. Halbarad saw it, the sword at his hip, the blade distinct in the gray November morning. catching what light the overcast permitted with the quality that a freshly reforged blade of good steel produced when the smiths who made it had done the work correctly. The shards of Narsil made whole. He had known it was coming. The message from Rivendell had said it was coming. Knowing it in a message and seeing it in a field were different categories of knowing, and the second category produced something in his chest that he did not have a ready word for, and did not try to name. Aragorn walked through the assembly to the Ford's center. The 2,000 watched him come. He stopped at the center and stood there and looked at the assembly. Halbarad counted. 1, 2, 3. The count reached 14 before Aragorn spoke, which was longer than most men could hold the attention of 2,000 people without speaking. And Aragorn held it without apparent effort, not through performance, not through any deliberate exercise of presence, but simply by being still in the specific way of someone who had arrived at a thing he had been approaching his whole life, and was taking the last second of the approach before the thing began. 14 seconds. The north stood. You held it. Now we take the south. 14 words. No rhetoric after them. No elaboration. The sentence had said what it needed to say in the register that it needed to say it, and adding to it would have been a diminishment of it. The 2,000 did not cheer. They exhaled. Not in unison, not the choreographed response of a trained military formation responding to a signal. The exhale moved through the assembly from the center outward, the way a pressure released moves through a medium. People at the Ford's center breathing first, and the breath finding its way to the column's edges over the span of 3 or 4 seconds. 2,000 people exhaling together, each of them releasing something they had been carrying at a specific tension for 30 years, or 100 years, or the entirety of a life spent waiting for a sentence that had now been spoken. Halbarad had stopped counting. There was nothing left to count toward. Nob had worked at the Prancing Pony for 11 years and could tell you, with reasonable accuracy, the usual contents of any given table in the common room at any given hour. This was not a skill he had set out to develop. It was what happened when you carried food and drink to the same 40 tables for 11 years while paying sufficient attention to avoid putting the wrong order in front of the wrong person. You learned what people drank and when they drank it, and what they looked like when they were drinking what they usually drank, versus what they looked like when they were drinking something different, for reasons that were not what they claimed. You learned which strangers sat with their backs to the wall. You learned which regulars had stopped being exactly regular in the specific way of people who were regular for a reason that had nothing to do with the quality of the pony's ale. He had learned a great deal in the last 3 months. He had not known what to do with most of it. The 3 men at the back corner table had arrived in the 3rd week of October. He had served them every evening since. 2 ales each, 1 meal, the specific corner seat that put their backs to the wall and their eyes on the room's full width, and the door's position in the room's left third. They were polite enough. Not friendly, not the warmth of men who came to the pony for the company, but courteous in the transactional way of people who needed a service and understood that the person providing it was a variable they should not antagonize unnecessarily. He had assessed them as travelers extended beyond their planned duration, men waiting for something or watching for something. In the specific way that waiting and watching produced an identical quality in a man's posture, when the man in question was good at neither concealing his purpose nor making it legible. He had not asked. The innkeeper, Barlaman Butterbur, had not asked either, not because Barlaman was incurious, but because the pony's policy on extended guests was to provide the service they paid for, and not to conduct the kind of examination that made guests stop paying for it. The 3 men paid. They were polite enough. They sat in the corner. By November, Nob had a count of 11 people in Bree, whose pattern of movement, association, and drinking schedule had changed in the last 2 months. In the specific way of people who were working around a center point, he could not see. He had not known what to do with the count. He was a server at an inn. He served. The disturbance came from the direction of Bill Fernie's house at approximately the 3rd hour after midnight. It was brief. Not violent in the acoustic sense of violence, not the sounds of a sustained engagement, the specific mix of impact and shouting and the breaking of furniture that a brawl produced. It was a brief, concentrated disturbance of approximately 90 seconds, followed by silence of the complete kind. Then, footsteps, measured and unhurried, moving away from Fernie's house in the direction of the Greenway's south approach. Then, nothing. Nob lay in his room above the pony's kitchen and listened to the nothing for 2 minutes. Then he went back to sleep, because the nothing was a different quality of nothing from the nothing that preceded something alarming. It was the nothing of a thing that had been resolved. He came down at the 6th hour for the kitchen's preparation and found the common room empty in the usual way. Chairs upended on tables for sweeping, the hearth banked for the night's last hours. The specific smell of an inn's common room after closing that was different from its smell at any other hour. He swept. He set the chairs down. He started the morning fire. He did not think about the disturbance until the room was done, and he had taken his usual survey of the tables, the professional inventory of his workspace before the day began, and registered the absence. The back corner table. He stood in the common room for 11 seconds looking at the table. It was a table. It was clean. It was empty in the way of a table whose regular occupants were not there, which was a different quality of empty from the way the table had been empty for the year before October, because for a year before October it had simply been a table, and now it was a table that was supposed to have 3 men at it, and did not. He went about the morning's work. The ranger came before the first guests arrived. 2 others with him, both with the lean, maintained quality of the man at the council, men who had been living carefully in difficult conditions for a long time, and had developed the specific competence that conditions demanded. They came through the pony's front door and stood in the common room, and the ranger, the one doing the talking slightly taller than the other 2, looked at the room with the look of a man confirming that what his intelligence had told him about a location matches the location as he finds it. He placed a document on the bar. Nob stood behind the bar. Butterbur had not come down yet. The ranger did not appear to need Butterbur to have come down. "This is the king's writ of protection for Breland," the ranger said. Not loud. The specific volume of a man who knows the room's acoustics and is using exactly the projection that the room requires. The roads are clean. The watch is restored. If you have names of those who trouble the north-south road, I will hear them. He waited. Nob had spent 3 months not knowing what to do with a count of 11 people. He opened his mouth and gave the ranger all 11 names in the order they had come to his attention, with the specific descriptive details: physical appearance, regular location, pattern of movement, that 11 years of professional observation had deposited in his memory. It took 4 minutes. The ranger listened to all 4 minutes with the attention of someone for whom the information was confirming a record rather than generating one. When Nob finished, the ranger looked at him for 2 seconds with the expression of a man recalibrating an assessment. "You've been keeping this count for how long?" "Since October." The ranger's expression did not change in any dramatic way. It changed in the small way of a man noting a data point that falls outside his projected range. He nodded once. He looked at the document on the bar. "That writ covers the pony specifically. If anyone gives you difficulty about what happened last night, show it to them." Nob looked at the document. The seal at its base was a 7-pointed star under a crown, a device he had seen in the archive illustrations in the Bree Council's records room, which he had visited once on an errand for Butterbur 7 years ago, and whose contents he had retained the way he retained things. He said, "That's the seal of Arnor." The ranger looked at him again. The recalibration expression returned, more pronounced. "It is. Arnor hasn't had a king for. It does now." The Dunédain column moved through Bree the following morning, at the 7th hour. Nob stood on the pony's threshold and watched it pass. He had imagined this sort of thing, the men of the West returning, the North's long quiet ending, in the abstract way that people imagined things they had grown up hearing about in old stories, with the quality of imagination that attached to things you did not fully expect to experience, directly. The reality of it was different from the imagination of it, in the specific way that direct experience was always different from the imagination of it, more ordinary in some respects, more overwhelming in others. The column was very large. The men in it were very tall. They moved in the specific way of people who were good at moving through terrain, and were currently moving through terrain that required less attention than the terrain they were used to, which gave their movement a quality of ease that was distinct from leisure, the ease of capability operating below its full engagement. The 300 elves behind the Dunédain were a different order of observation entirely, and he filed that separately. An old Bree man was standing 20 feet from Nob along the road's edge, watching the column pass with the specific expression of a man whose grandfather had told him something he had not quite believed. The old man said to no one in particular, "My grandfather said the Rangers would come back one day." He watched another 50 yards of column pass. He said, "He didn't mention the elves." Nob watched the elves pass, and considered that there were things old stories left out, whether from economy or from the recognition that some things required direct experience rather than description, and that his grandfather's stories had probably been accurate as far as they went, and had simply not gone far enough. The column continued south on the Greenway. The road behind it was clean. It had not been clean in 40 years. The Uruk-hai scout commander's name was not recorded in any document his commanders maintained, because the document his commanders maintained recorded outcomes rather than names. And the outcome of his assignment was a report that his superiors at Isengard would study for 3 weeks without arriving at a satisfactory tactical explanation. He had been given 200 Uruk-hai and a 3-mile screen across the gap of Rohan's northern approach, which was standard perimeter doctrine for monitoring the north-south road at the gap's near side. The doctrine was sound. 3 miles of dispersed screen provided early warning of any force moving south along the road, with sufficient depth to get a warning rider clear before a conventional military formation could close the distance. He had run this screen for 11 months, against various Rohirric patrol movements and a Gondorian courier operation in September, and the doctrine had performed correctly each time. He had deployed his 200 in the standard pattern, 6 observation posts at half-mile intervals along the screen's front, each post with 4 Uruk-hai and a signal capability. The remaining forces distributed in depth behind the front line, with 2 dedicated warning rider positions at the screen's eastern and western anchors. By his professional assessment, a force moving south on the road would have 11 to 14 minutes of warning time, from first contact to warning rider departure. He had based this on how long it took a conventional force to cover the distance between the road's visible approach and the screen's front line. He had not based it on anything else, because there had been nothing else in his experience to base it on. The first indication that something was wrong was the silence at Post 3. Posts communicated on a 2-hour schedule, a brief signal confirming position and status received at the command post and logged. Post 3's second-hour signal did not arrive. This was not immediately alarming. Signal failures occurred, equipment malfunctioned, individual soldiers made errors. He sent a runner to Post 3 at the 14-minute mark, which was the standard protocol for a missed signal. The runner did not return. At the 28-minute mark, he sent 2 Uruk-hai to Post 3's location. They did not return either. He was assembling his assessment of what this indicated when Post 2's signal also failed. The posts, he understood at this point, were not failing to signal. They were not present to signal from. The distinction was operationally significant, and he updated his threat model to account for it, which produced a threat model that did not match any threat model in his doctrine, because his doctrine did not include a threat capable of removing 2 observation posts. 8 Uruk-hai, experienced in defensive positions, in terrain they had occupied for 11 months, without producing any sound that carried to the command post 600 yards behind them. He ordered the warning riders out. Neither reached the screen's eastern anchor. The encirclement closed from 3 directions in what the survivor's account would later estimate as approximately 40 seconds. The survivor was the command post's logistics officer, who was present because he had been updating the supply manifest when the encirclement began, and who survived because the encirclement's purpose was intelligence rather than elimination. The force that closed wanted someone alive and capable of providing the report that the Isengard command structure needed to receive. What he could tell the command structure afterward was limited. He had not seen the encirclement close from the outside. He had been inside it. From inside it, the experience was of figures appearing from terrain that his 11 months of operating in it had told him was not sufficient cover for the approach he was witnessing. Figures that were moving through ground he had assessed as impassable for any force larger than 2 or 3 individuals, and there were demonstrably not 2 or 3 of them. The archery began at a distance he could not precisely measure, because he was not a man accustomed to being on the receiving end of archery operations, and his attention was distributed across several simultaneous stimuli that were competing for priority. What he could tell the command structure was that the archers were engaged before he could see them clearly, and that the range at which they were engaged was substantially beyond the range at which his unit's own bows were effective, and that by the time the range had closed, to the point where his unit's bows could have answered, the situation had developed in ways that made answering a secondary priority. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. He was the most informative witness available, and his account contained the following specific gaps. He could not describe the attacking forces' formation doctrine. He could not describe their individual equipment beyond gray and green, moving quietly, and he could not explain how Post 3's 8 Uruk-hai had been removed without audible engagement. He could explain one thing clearly. He had not, in the engagement's 40 minutes, seen any of the attacking force behave in a way that indicated they were afraid of him, or of anything present in the immediate operational environment. Aragorn was 600 yards north of the contact point when it began. He had positioned himself there deliberately, not because the contact required his direction, which it did not, but because the contact was information, and information was more useful at 600 yards than at the line of engagement, where the specific noise and visual complexity of a close engagement produced the kind of attention narrowing that the commander's role could not afford. He watched the screen from 600 yards through the early morning's gray light and received the contact's development the way you received a sequence you had already modeled, confirming or adjusting the model as each event located itself against the prediction. Elladan had positioned the encirclement from 2 days of prior reconnaissance, 2 days during which the Elvish vanguard had moved through the Uruk-hai screen without triggering it, which was not operationally surprising to anyone who had worked with elves in the field, but which was, he understood, going to be a specific problem for the Isengard command structure's ability to develop accurate doctrine about what it was facing. You could not develop accurate doctrine for an opponent who had an Elvish reconnaissance capability if you had never encountered an Elvish reconnaissance capability, because the capability operated at a level of terrain integration that no Orcish training program could replicate or account for. The contact ended at the 40-minute mark. Halbarad appeared at his shoulder. He had heard him coming for the last 30 seconds, which was not a failure of Halbarad's movement skills, but a deliberate signal that he was approaching. The specific protocol of a man who had worked around commanders long enough to understand that appearing silently beside a man who was watching a tactical engagement was a way of producing outcomes that required medical attention. One survivor, Halbarad said. Logistics. He'll travel. What was their warning rider timing? They didn't get a rider out. Aragorn looked at the terrain between the contact point and the screen's eastern anchor. He ran the geometry, the anchor's position, the distance, the specific terrain characteristics that Elladan's reconnaissance had identified and exploited. He found the answer in the geometry without being told it. Their doctrine assumed a conventional approach on the road, he said. Halbarad said nothing, because nothing needed adding. The survivor's report reached Isengard's council chamber 9 days later. The report was thorough. The logistics officer was a precise man and had done his best to provide the Isengard command structure with everything his account contained. He described the terrain. He described the timing. He described the archery range, with the specific caveat that his measurement was approximate. He described the absence of any behavior in the attacking force that he could categorize as fear. This last element produced more discussion than any of the tactical details, because the tactical details, the range, the timing, the encirclement geometry, were analyzable within the framework of an unusually capable opponent. The absence of fear was not analyzable within that framework, because the framework assumed that opponents experienced fear as a variable that tactical doctrine managed through threat and overwhelming force. An opponent that did not exhibit fear as a variable was outside the framework entirely, and the Council had no sub-framework for that case. One of the Uruk-hai commanders asked the survivor to clarify. The survivor clarified, in 40 minutes of engagement, at the ranges involved, having watched 12 of his unit taken out of action in the first 7 minutes, he had not observed a single attacker produce any behavioral indicator consistent with the threat response pattern that 41 years of engaging human and near-human opponents had deposited in his threat assessment model. The commander asked, "Fear of what? Fear of us specifically, or—" "Fear," the survivor said, "of anything present." The council processed this. One commander had a tactical recommendation. One had a request for additional intelligence. The third, who had been in the longest service and who had developed across that service the specific property of knowing which problems had solutions and which problems had a different category of response, said nothing for 11 seconds. Then he said, "Where is the prisoner now?" "At the column's supply train." "Being adequately treated?" Another 11 seconds. "They took a prisoner for the report," the third commander said. "Not a question. They planned to have a report sent back." He looked at the document in front of him. "They wanted us to know what happened." The council was quiet. The third commander set the report down on the table. "Their doctrine hasn't been updated for our tactics," he said, which was not a sentence about his own side's doctrine. He said it the way you said a true thing that was also a report from an unfamiliar angle. The angle of a man reading a message that had been sent deliberately and understanding what the sender intended him to understand. He had no battle plan to offer after it. He had a defense plan. The distinction was everything, and the room understood this, and no one said anything else for a considerable time. Saruman had been revising his operational timeline since the Gap engagement. He had revised it 3 times. Once when the survivors' report arrived at Isengard, and he had read it in the specific order that produced the most accurate understanding, beginning with the tactical details and working toward the summary, rather than the reverse. Once when his own Orthong Stone surveillance of the Dunédain column's march rate had returned figures that did not match any model he had constructed for a force of that composition and size. And once, 4 days after the second revision, when his Southern Intelligence Network had confirmed that the column's supply chain was not following the column, was not in fact following in any conventional sense, because the column's supply arrangements had been pre-positioned at intervals along the route in the weeks before the march began. Pre-positioned supply for a force of 2,000 across 400 miles of march route. He had sat with this information for 11 minutes before opening his ledger. The Dunédain had been planning this march for longer than the Council of Elrond. The supply pre-positioning required months of preparation, the identification of locations, the movement of stores, the security arrangements that kept pre-positioned stores from being consumed by other parties before the column reached them. This was not a force assembled in response to a crisis. This was a force that had been assembling, in the operational sense, for years, possibly decades. He had written in his ledger, "The North is not disorganized. It has been organizing for a very long time." He had looked at this sentence and found it accurate, and had understood that an accurate sentence was only useful when it arrived early enough to inform a response, and this accurate sentence had arrived significantly later than that. He located the column at the Grey Flood on the 7th day of December. The Orthanc stone showed him the ruins of Tharbad from the northeast, the specific angle his surveillance had established as optimal for the Grey Flood crossing's geography, giving him the river's full width and both banks with sufficient resolution to read operational detail. He had been checking this view every 6 hours since the Gap engagement, updating his model of the column's progress against the model's predictions, finding each update within the projected range but at the projected range's faster edge. The column had arrived at Tharbad 2 days ahead of his fastest projection. He confirmed this by checking the column's position against the Grey Flood's eastern bank geography, the specific ruins of the bridge's eastern foundation, which were identifiable in the stone's site by the cut stone quality of Númenórean construction, visible even in Tharbad's current condition. The column's lead elements were at those foundations. The main body was strung along the eastern approach road for approximately a mile behind them. He settled in to watch what a force without bridging capability did at an uncrossable river. The timber was already there. This was the first revision he made to his current model, a revision forced in the first hour of his observation, when it became apparent that the column had not arrived at Tharbad to assess the crossing problem. The column had arrived at Tharbad, with the crossing problem already assessed, and its solution distributed among the supply wagons at the column's rear, which had been pulling components he had registered as timber cargo for 400 miles, and which he now understood were not timber cargo in the generic sense. They were bridge components, prefabricated by the evidence of how they were being handled, pieces that fit each other with a precision that prefabrication produced, offloaded from the wagons in a sequence that indicated the sequence had been planned before loading. The engineering teams worked in the organized pattern of people executing a procedure they had practiced rather than improvising one they were developing. He watched the components come off the wagons. He watched the teams begin work at the eastern foundation. He ran calculations in the margin of his ledger, the component dimensions as he could estimate them from the stone's site, the foundation geometry, the load requirements for crossing 2,000 troops and supply wagons at the pace the column had been maintaining. The calculations produced a construction timeline. He ran the calculations 3 times to confirm consistency. 6 days. The engineer's name was Dir Mayan, and he had spent 40 years rebuilding structures in Eriador's wilderness, not the architectural rebuilding of peacetime, the functional rebuilding of a people who could not afford specialists for every task, and who therefore produced individuals capable of reading a structural problem and solving it with what was available. He had rebuilt bridges over flooded rivers in autumn conditions, using the timber available in the immediate radius. He had re-roofed the hidden settlement above the last bridge, 3 times using stone quarried from the hillside, rather than materials brought from any distance. He had developed, across 40 years of this work, the specific practical knowledge of a man who understood the relationship between available materials and required outcomes at a level that was not quite engineering in the formal sense, and was not quite craftsmanship in the formal sense, but was, both of them expressed through a lifetime of solving specific problems under specific constraints. Halbarad had given him the Tharbad problem 8 months ago, which was 4 months before the Council of Elrond's formal proceedings, which meant the council had been the public moment of a decision the chieftain had made long before it, and the bridge had been one of the first consequences of that private decision made concrete in the world. Not the specific problem, the category. He had said, "We will need to cross the Grey Flood with a large force and limited time." He had not specified the size of the force or the duration of the available time, because 8 months ago those figures were not finalized. He had said, "Plan for 2006 days as a working assumption, and tell me what you need." Dunédain had spent 2 months working out the component specifications. He had spent 4 months coordinating their production across 7 different workshops in Eriador's hidden settlements, each workshop producing the specific pieces that the component design required, in the quantities the component count required, to the dimensional tolerances that the joinery required. He had spent 2 months coordinating their loading into the supply wagons in the sequence that the construction procedure required. At Tharbad's eastern bank on the 7th of December, he was standing in front of a problem he had been solving for 8 months, with the components arrayed behind him in the order he had specified. And the only remaining variable was the execution, which was the part of the problem he had the most direct control over. He put his teams to work. Saruman watched. He watched for 6 days, checking the stone's view every 6 hours, watching the bridge take its shape from the eastern foundation outward. The Númenórean joinery technique was visible in the stone's site, not in its specific detail, which the resolution did not support, but in the effect it produced. Components coming together with the specific economy of a design in which each piece's position was determined before assembly began. The structure growing not by accumulation, but by completion of a form that was already present in the design. He recognized the technique. It was in the records. Rivendell's archive held the technical documentation of Númenórean construction methods that had not been used at scale in 3,000 years. He had studied those records. He had categorized the techniques by their applicability to various operational scenarios. He had assessed the joinery system as theoretically capable of producing military bridging at rates significantly faster than conventional construction, but had categorized the assessment as academically interesting rather than operationally relevant, because the technique required prefabrication at the component level, and prefabrication required lead time, and lead time required knowing in advance that you were going to need the bridge. Knowing in advance, he updated his model of the Dunédain operations planning horizon for the 4th time in 3 weeks. He was running out of room in the ledger's margin. On the 6th day's morning, Aragorn crossed the Grey Flood on the bridge's first completed span. Saruman watched through the Orthanc stone and noted, with the specific quality of a man observing a symbolic act that was not primarily symbolic, that was primarily an engineering verification. The commander confirming the structure could bear load before the force committed to it, that the act was both things simultaneously. The King of Arnor, walking the first crossing of a bridge over the Grey Flood at the site of Tharbad, was a symbolic act with 3,000 years of political weight behind it. It was also a man testing a bridge. Both things were visible in how he walked it. He walked without performance, his attention on the bridge's surface and on the river below and on the join quality of the span's component sections, not on the 400 rangers and 300 elves watching from the eastern bank. He reached the western bank, stood for 4 seconds, and looked south. Then he turned and nodded to Dunédain. Dunédain relayed the nod to his teams. The crossing began. Saruman closed the stone's cloth over the view and sat in the silence of the Orthanc for 11 minutes. He had 4 response options as of 6 days ago. He opened his ledger to the page where he had written them. He drew a line through 3 of them. The greenway to Rohan was the Dunédain's road now. The gap of Rohan's western approach was flanked. The supply convoys from Isengard's northern network were interrupted at the one crossing point they could not bypass. The column was south of the Grey Flood. He closed the ledger. He opened a new page and wrote at its top, in the clean hand he used for documents he intended to keep, Defense of Orthanc. He began the only planning that the current situation permitted. The satisfaction of the operation, if satisfaction was the available word for a man whose satisfaction derived from the correctness of assessments, was in the sentence he wrote in the margin before beginning. They knew they would need this bridge. They knew it 8 months ago at the earliest. He underlined the figure, at the earliest. He sat with the underlining for 3 seconds. Then he began to write. Treebeard had made his decision 3 weeks before the Dunédain arrived. This was the specific thing he told Aragorn afterward, in the unhurried way that Ents told things, that the decision had not been made because the army had come, but that the army had come and the decision had already been made. And the relationship between these two facts was not causation, but confirmation. He had been deciding since late November, which was when his runners had brought him word of the column's size and composition, and the specific quality of authority that moved at its head. He had been thinking about Saruman's trees, about what Isengard's smoke had been doing to the forest's western edge for 60 years, about the specific ongoing cost of an ongoing problem that the Third Age had not produced anyone with the authority to end. The Dunédain were not the reason he had acted. They were the reason he had acted now, which was a distinction he understood, and which he conveyed to Aragorn with the patience of a being for whom the difference between a decision and its occasion was not a subtle philosophical point, but an obvious practical one. Isengard's ring was broken when the Dunédain arrived. The waters had receded over 3 days, leaving the specific wreckage of Saruman's industrial operation exposed under a January sky. The machinery half submerged in silt. The furnace infrastructure collapsed at the waterline. The specific ordered devastation of something that had been precisely constructed and was now precisely ruined. The ring of Isengard, which had been an enclosed industrial valley 48 hours ago, was an enclosed lake with a tower at its center. Orthanc stood. Of course it stood. Saruman had spent 2,000 years in Middle-earth and had studied Númenórean construction methods with the comprehensive attention of a man who understood that the things you studied were the things you survived. The tower was Númenórean stone of the original construction, not built by Saruman, built by the men whose tradition Aragorn had inherited, and its foundations went to a depth that no flood Treebeard could release had the capacity to undermine. It stood in the center of the ruin, with the specific quality of something that was meant to be outrun by the destruction around it. Saruman was inside it. Aragorn stood at Orthanc's base in the morning of the column's second day at Isengard. He had given the column a day's rest at the ruin's eastern approach, not from operational sentiment, but because 6 weeks of march from Sarn Ford had produced in the force's supply and medical capacity a specific need for a day's attention that the next phase did not allow for. He had spent the day of rest with Treebeard, who had a great deal to say about what Isengard had been and what it had done to the forest's western margin, and he had listened to all of it with the attention it deserved, which was substantial. Treebeard's account of 60 years of forest damage was also an intelligence document about Saruman's operational priorities and resource consumption, and intelligence documents were not shortened. On the second morning he walked to Orthanc's base, with Halbarad at his right and Elladan at his left, and 200 Dunédain in the open ground behind them. And he looked up at the tower's height and the closed door at its base, and the window 80 feet above the door where Saruman's presence was detectable in the specific way that a powerful intelligence attending carefully to something made the air feel attended to. He did not raise his voice. The quality of the morning, still, the specific winter stillness of a valley whose water had settled in the last 24 hours to a reflective surface, carried sound with the efficiency that still water produced. He said, "Curunir." The voice came from the window above. Not immediately. There was a pause of 11 seconds, which was the pause of a being recalibrating his approach to a situation that had not developed according to his prepared assessment of its likely development. Then the voice came, and it came in the register that Saruman used, when the register of political persuasion had been selected as the optimal instrument for the encounter's opening phase. It was an impressive instrument. The sub-frequency that the voice carried at its best operation, the quality that made listeners feel the argument they were hearing, was the argument they themselves would have made with sufficient time and reflection. Registered on several of the younger Eriador-descended fighters in the column's front ranks as an involuntary step forward. He saw them step. He saw the ranger captain to their left place a hand on the nearest man's shoulder, firmly but without aggression, the gesture of a supervisor correcting a reflex rather than a decision. The voice was saying something about the war's cost, about the lives of men already spent, and the lives that the current approach would spend before it concluded. About the specific mathematics of a siege, mortar's remaining capacity, the ring-bearer's difficulty, the question of whether the overt campaign's cost in time and men was a cost the Free Peoples could sustain against an enemy who did not sustain costs in the same way. Every fact in it was accurate. He waited for the voice to finish. He spoke in the formal quenya of the kings of Arnor. Not the quenya of scholarship, the high register of ceremonial speech in which Númenórean kingship had been proclaimed and transferred across 3,500 years of the House of Isildur's maintenance of a tradition Saruman had arrived in Middle-earth to find already established, the register that predated Saruman's presence here, the register in which the Orthanc stone's ownership had been documented, in which the 7 Palantiri had been distributed, in which Elendil had spoken the words of foundation when he first set foot on Middle-earth from the ruin of Númenor. He spoke one word, Curunir. Not Saruman, not the Westron name by which the White Wizard had been known for 2,000 years of operation in Middle-earth's political environment. The quenya form of the name he had been given as a Maya of Aule before the Third Age, before the Second Age, before the war that had ended the First Age and reshaped the world. The name that located him not in the category of wizard or political operative, but in the category of Maya, a category whose relationship to the House of Isildur was documented, specific, and had existed since before Númenor was raised from the sea. The voice stopped, not gradually. The voice was not a thing that stopped gradually, because the voice's technique required continuous maintenance, and the maintenance had a specific engagement state that was either running or not. It stopped in the specific way of a machine whose operator had ceased to operate it, which was an immediate cessation. The window above the door was quiet for 18 seconds. Then, "What do you want from this tower?" Still the high register, quenya matching quenya, because Saruman understood what register he was operating in now, and understood that the register required a response in kind. But the voice quality was absent. What came from the window above the door was a being choosing his words with care rather than choosing words that worked on people who heard them. "The Orthanc stone," Aragorn said, "in quenya, in the register of a king stating the disposition of his property. By right of the House of Elendil, whose stone it was, and whose heir I am, I will have it when this door is opened." 18 seconds. Then, the door will be opened. Grima Wormtongue came down the tower at the 3rd hour of the afternoon. He came alone. Saruman above, sending the errand down rather than descending to perform it, because descending to perform it was a specific kind of submission that the voice had made a career of ensuring other people performed, rather than performing himself. Grima came with the stone wrapped in black cloth, and the specific quality of a man who had been assigned this task without being given a script for what came after. He crossed the water on the stepping stones the Ents had left passable, and walked to Aragorn and extended the cloth without speaking. Aragorn took it. He removed the cloth with one hand, and held the stone in both, uncovered, in the open air of the ruined ring of Isengard. The stone was a weight his hands recognized immediately, not from prior holding, but from the 300 years of documentation about its weight and size in Rivendell's records, that had made its physical characteristics as familiar as the description of something he had studied his whole life. Grima looked at the stone. He looked at Aragorn. He looked at the 2,000 Dunédain arrayed across the ruins behind them, in the loose formation the column had adopted for the rest. Not a battle formation, simply the natural distribution of a large force occupying available ground. Each individual carrying the specific quality of accumulated competence that 80 years of fieldwork deposited in a person's bearing, and which was, in aggregate, a form of presence that did not require arrangement or amplification. Grima said nothing. He went back to the stepping stones. He crossed them. The tower door closed. Above the door, at the window 80 feet up, the presence that had been attending carefully to everything since the second morning was still attending carefully. But the Orthanc stone was in Aragorn's hands, which meant the careful attention now had no instrument through which to act on whatever it was attending to. Saruman, inside Orthanc, alone, with no stone and no army and no intelligence network, and a man standing outside who had called him by his Maya name in the language in which that name was first spoken, and then received the stone that was his by inheritance without ceremony or performance, or any quality that suggested he had been uncertain, at any point in the preceding 3 hours, that he would receive it. The stone was warm in Aragorn's hands, with the specific warmth of an object that had been actively used until recently. He wrapped it in the cloth. He did not speak about the warmth, or about what the warmth indicated about how recently the stone had been used, or what it had been used to observe. He carried it to the position in the column where it would travel, and noted that Halbarad, who had been present for the entirety of the exchange, was looking at the tower with the expression of a man updating his professional assessment of several variables simultaneously. "He addressed you back," Halbarad said, "in Quenya." Then he caught himself. Then, in the common speech, he matched the register. He knew what the register was. Yes, Halbarad considered this. That means he understood what you were telling him when you said his name. It means he understood it precisely. Halbarad looked at the tower for 3 more seconds. And he opened the door anyway. Aragorn did not answer, because the answer was in the stone in his hands, and in the closed tower behind him, and in the 18 seconds of silence that had preceded the door's opening. And Halbarad had already arrived at the answer independently, which was why he had phrased the observation as a statement rather than a question. Saruman had understood exactly what the Quenya register signified, and had understood exactly what Curunir meant coming from the man saying it. And he had opened the door. The distance between what a being was capable of and what a being chose to do when confronted with the full, accurate, documented weight of what it was facing, that distance was the chapter's information, and the chapter's information was complete. The Outriders returned to Edoras in the late afternoon of the 3rd day of January, and reported to Théoden King in the specific register of soldiers who had seen something outside their established reference points and were being professional about it. The first Outrider was a man of 28 years, with 11 years of rider service. He had seen Gondorian formations, Dunlending raiding parties, and in one engagement, near the fords of Isen, a mixed force of Uruk-hai and Dunlendings that had been the largest opposing force he had encountered in his professional life. He had counted that force at approximately 400, which had been alarming enough that the count was the first piece of information in his report. He gave Théoden his count of the Dunédain column before anything else. "More than 1,000, he said. "Beyond 1,000 by some margin I could not close enough to establish exactly, because the column extends past the visible range from the position I was holding." Théoden said, "Formation, together, my lord. All of them, in step." Théoden said, "What do you mean, in step?" The Outrider considered how to be precise about this. In the Rohirrim, on a march, the step synchronizes at the front of the formation and disperses toward the rear over distance. The rear of a long column does not sound like the front. This column's step was consistent along its full visible length. I could hear it from approximately half a mile. He had a further observation and delivered it with the care of a man reporting something that fell outside the standard vocabulary of military description. "They are tall, my lord. Each man is tall. Not some of them, each of them." Théoden looked at him for 3 seconds. "How tall?" "Taller than the tallest rider I know by a hand's width at minimum. The ones at the column's head by more than that. The ones at the column's head are—" He stopped. He began again. "The histories describe the men of Númenor, my lord. I have read the passage that describes them in the Book of the Mark. I had not, until this afternoon, had occasion to compare the passage against direct observation." Théoden was quiet for 7 seconds. Then he said, "Ride back. Tell them the king of Rohan will receive them at Edoras." Éowyn was on the wall when the column appeared on the eastern road. She had been on the wall since the Outrider's return, not from any specific instruction, but because the wall was where you went when something was approaching that you needed to see clearly before it reached you. And she had read the Outrider's expression when he dismounted and knew that his report contained something that required direct observation rather than description. She had read the histories, not merely the passages about the men of Númenor's height, which was the Outrider's reference point. She had read the comprehensive accounts, the last alliance, the war of the elves and Sauron, the specific record of what the armies of the West had looked like at their full capacity in the Second Age, when Númenorian power was at its height. She had read them with the attention of someone who found military history genuinely interesting rather than merely necessary, and who therefore retained it at a level of detail that went beyond the summary assessment. The column appeared around the eastern road's final bend at the 2nd hour after midday. She watched it resolve from the distance, the gray-green of the Dunedain's gear first, the column's head emerging from the road's curve into the Pelinor's eastern approach. and then the column's full leading extent visible as the bend straightened and the road's geometry allowed the full distance to the eye. Behind the Dunedain's main body, the white gold of the Rivendell elves. She had read the accounts. The accounts were accurate in their specific details, and insufficient in their aggregate effect, which was the relationship that direct experience always had to prior accounts of the thing directly experienced. Andúril caught the afternoon sun as the column's head reached the road's final straight approach to Edoras, the blade at the leading figure's hip, the reforged steel's quality visible at distance in the specific way that good steel in winter light announced itself. She did not know the man carrying it at this range. She knew what he was carrying. She stood on the wall and watched the column come. Théoden met Aragorn at the gate. This was not the formal reception arrangement his chamberlain had proposed. A reception in the Golden Hall, the full ceremony of a visiting king, the specific choreography of power acknowledging power in the terms that ceremony established. Théoden had considered it and had decided against it, not from any strategic calculation, but from the direct instinct of a king who had been on his throne for 20 years and who knew what ceremonies were for and what they were not for. Ceremonies were for establishing relationships that were not yet established. He walked to the gate. Aragorn came through it without ceremony, in campaign gear, Andúril at his hip, the ring of Barahir on his right hand, the Sceptre of Annúminas at his belt, with the specific placement of something that was being carried rather than displayed. He was taller than the gate's frame by less than it appeared from a distance, which was a trick of attention rather than architecture. They looked at each other for 3 seconds. Théoden said, "The mark remembers the men of the West." Aragorn said, "The men of the West remember the Eotheo." They had both gone to the same place with the first words. Not to the present alliance, not to the current war, but to the founding relationship, the agreement that predated Rohan as a kingdom and predated the Rohirrim as a people's current political form, the specific ancestral bond the histories called the Oath of Eorl, not as a negotiating position, as an acknowledgement of what was already present. The alliance did not require negotiation. It required recognition. Éowyn presented herself to the council on the second evening. She had prepared what she would say and discarded the preparation on the stairs, because the preparation assumed a specific kind of resistance that she wanted to be ready for, and that she now suspected was not the resistance she would encounter. She had prepared for the argument that shield maidens were not soldiers. She had prepared for the argument that her place was at Edoras in the king's absence. She had prepared for the argument that her desire to ride was personal rather than tactical, and personal desires did not govern military deployment. She had not prepared for the absence of those arguments. She came into the council room and stated her request in the direct register that the room required. She was Éowyn, of the House of Eorl, the king's niece, one of the Rohirrim's finest riders, trained in sword work to a standard she could document against opponents the room knew. She wished to ride with the army, not disguised, not hidden, as herself, under her own name, in Rohan's tradition. She gave the council the tradition's specifics. The Eotheod shield maidens had ridden in the founding wars before Calenardon was granted to them. The tradition was documented. The mark did not forbid it. The current practice of women remaining behind during the campaign was custom rather than law, and she was making a case to the custom rather than the law. She finished. She looked at Aragorn. He said, "Rohan's shield maidens rode with the Eotheod before your king's grandfather's grandfather. I will not tell you what your own tradition permits." He turned to Théoden. Théoden looked at his niece. He had been looking at her, Éowyn understood, with a specific quality of attention since the previous evening. The attention of a man recalibrating how he was seeing something that had been in front of him for 20 years, and that he had been seeing he was beginning to understand, at a reduction. He looked at her in full resolution now. She held the look without adjustment, because adjustment was a form of presenting something other than what you were, and she was not making that choice in this room, on this evening. Théoden said, "She rides." Éowyn said nothing. She had spent 20 years waiting for a sentence that permitted her to be accurately present in the world her tradition had built, and then declined to show her. The sentence was 3 words. She did not perform the relief she felt, because relief was a private condition, and the room's business was not private conditions. She said, "Thank you, my lord." She left the council. In the corridor outside, she stood for 4 seconds in the specific stillness of a person who has been told the truth about what they are allowed to be, and as taking the first second in which the truth is actual rather than theoretical. Then she went to see about her armor. The combined force departed Edoras at the fourth day's dawn. The Rohirrim's departure from Edoras had its own ceremony, the traditional forms, the specific words, the riding out in the formation that the mark used when it rode to war. Théoden performed them correctly, in the register they required, with the authority of a man who had been performing them for 20 years, and who understood that the forms were not empty. The Dunédain formed up on the eastern road as the Rohirrim rode out. The two forces occupied the same road for the first time at the third hour. Éowyn was near the front of the Rohirrim's line when the Dunédain formation came alongside. She looked at the nearest ranger, a man of approximately 50 years of appearance, which she now understood meant 130 years of actual age, which meant 90 years of continuous combat experience in service of a cause he had maintained, without recognition or material support for the entirety of that time. He looked straight ahead. He had been looking straight ahead for 90 years. She looked straight ahead also. The combined force moved south on the Greenway under a January sky that carried the specific quality of a winter morning at the beginning of the thing the winter had been building toward. Behind them, Edoras. Ahead, Gondor, and the road to the Morannon, and the specific weight of what was coming that was also what they had been carrying toward their whole lives. The step of the Dunédain was consistent along the column's full extent. She could hear it beside her. It sounded, she thought, like something that had been moving for a long time and had found its direction. Denethor had prepared 7 arguments. He had begun the first argument on the 23rd of November, the day after his intelligence network confirmed that the column was real. Not a rumor of the kind that proliferated in the third year of a war's approach. Not an exaggerated account of a small ranger force making symbolic gestures along the Greenway, but an actual military formation of actual size moving south at an actual pace. He had spent one day confirming the intelligence from 4 separate sources. Then he had opened the ledger he used for the stewardship's most significant operational planning, and written the first argument at the top of its first page. The arguments were good. He had produced good arguments his entire professional life. He had governed Gondor with competence for 34 years, in the absence of a king, which was a task that required the capacity to identify the correct position on complex questions and defend it against the various pressures that competing interests applied. He had developed this capacity to a level that no other administrator in Middle-earth's current political landscape could match. The arguments he had prepared were the product of that capacity and of 34 years of institutional knowledge about Gondor's constitutional history, its military command structure, and the specific legal frameworks that govern the relationship between the stewardship and any claimant to the throne. The arguments were good. He had finished the 7th argument on the 15th of January. He had read all 7 back in sequence on the 16th. Looking for weaknesses, he found 3 places where the logic required support that he had not yet supplied, and supplied it. He found one place where the argument's foundation depended on a historical precedent he had cited from memory, and went to the archive to confirm the citation. The citation was accurate. On the 17th he read them again. On the evening of the 17th, his intelligence officer had confirmed the column's position at the Pelinor's northern approach, a day ahead of his fastest projection, which was itself a piece of information that the 7 arguments did not account for, and which he noted in the ledger's margin without yet understanding what he would do with the note. Aragorn entered Minas Tirith's main gate at the 2nd hour of the 18th of January. Denethor watched from the tower. He watched because the Anor Stone was covered and would remain covered for this event, which was a decision he had made at the 16th's evening, and which he did not question now. The stone showed him things, selected with a care he had understood for 3 months, was not his own, and the things it showed him were true and arranged in the sequence that produced a specific effect, and he was not going to let it arrange his first direct sight of Aragorn, son of Arathorn, in whatever sequence it would have chosen. He watched with his own eyes from the tower. The gate opened. Aragorn came through it. In campaign gear, which Denethor had expected, the intelligence had been consistent that this was a man who did not distinguish between his public and operational presentation, which was itself a form of political statement that the 7 arguments did not address directly, but which was consistent with the profile they addressed. Behind Aragorn, Halbarad, and the sons of Elrond, and the Rivendell elves, and the Dunédain, not all 2,000 at the gate, which the gate could not accommodate, but the leading elements of the column, filing through in the specific organized way of a force that had been marching together for 6 weeks and had developed the unconscious coordination of a unit rather than an assembly. Denethor looked at them for 47 seconds. Then he went to meet the steward's guest. He had arranged the reception hall with precision. The chairs in the specific configuration that the stewardship's formal reception protocol specified for the meeting of peers, which Aragorn was not, legally, in the configuration Denethor was maintaining for the purpose of this meeting, but which the configuration communicated as the available framing. The white staff of the stewardship on its stand to his right, the heraldic banners of the House of Hurin and the House of Anarion framing the hall's rear wall. The specific combination of significant objects and spatial arrangements that established, at the room's level of initial communication, the institutional context of the encounter. Aragorn walked into the hall. He looked at the arrangement for 4 seconds. He sat in the chair across the table from Denethor, with the ease of a man sitting in a chair. He did not comment on the arrangement. He did not perform the not commenting on the arrangement. He simply sat, and in sitting the arrangement became a thing that had been arranged for a purpose, and had not achieved the purpose, because the purpose required the person who encountered the arrangement to engage with it on its terms, and Aragorn had not engaged with it on its terms. The framing was Denethor's. It had not taken. He delivered the first 2 arguments. He had selected the first 2 because they were the arguments most likely to establish the procedural frame he needed for the remaining 5. The constitutional argument first, the military chain of command argument second, both of them accurate in their specific claims, both of them pointing toward the same conclusion, that the operational context of an active siege was not the correct moment for the stewardship to address a succession question whose legal resolution required the full council, whose composition included parties not currently in Minas Tirith, and whose process the relevant constitutional documents specified in terms that did not admit of shortcuts regardless of who was making the request. He delivered them well. Aragorn listened to both with the attentiveness of a man who was actually following the argument rather than waiting for it to finish. The specific quality of listening that indicated the content was being processed rather than merely tolerated. He listened to the end of the second argument and was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Those are reasonable points for peacetime administration." He moved on. Not with a counter-argument, not with a specific rebuttal that would have engaged with the arguments on their own terms and produced a debate in which the argument's quality became the relevant standard. He moved on the way you moved on, from a thing that had been said and received and acknowledged and placed in its correct location, which was a location that was not the center of the current business. "When Mordor's armies have been destroyed, I will hear them from the proper council," he said, and then he turned to the map on the table's right side, which Denethor had placed there for his own reference during the council that was supposed to follow the reception, and asked about the supply situation on the Pelinor's eastern approach. He asked about the supply situation with the specific quality of a man for whom knowing the supply situation was the next required piece of information, and who had found the person most likely to have it. He was not dismissing Denethor's arguments. He was operating in a world in which the arguments were not the current business, and the supply situation was the current business, and the distance between those 2 facts was not a matter of debate. He treated the city as his to administer, not aggressively, not with the performance of authority that insecure authority produced, with the ease of a man for whom the city was his to administer, because it was, and who had other things to do. Denethor reached for the Anor stone that evening. He had told himself he would not. He had made the decision on the 16th, and had not reversed it, and he reversed it now, at the 3rd hour of the evening, because the 7 arguments had been prepared, and 2 of them had been delivered, and neither of them had done what he had prepared them to do, and the specific quality of his current situation required information that the Anor stone was the only available source of. He sat at the stone for 40 minutes. He looked at the city. He had not expected to look at the city. He had gone to the stone for intelligence about the northern front, about Mordor's current disposition, about the variables the 7 arguments needed to address if they were going to be reconfigured for the encounter's actual dynamics. The stone showed him Minas Tirith. The stone had shown him Minas Tirith before, had shown him selected visions of the siege's projected progression, the specific imagery that Sauron's curation had chosen to install in the steward's operational model. He had looked at those visions and had built his assessment of the war's situation on their foundation, and the foundation had produced in him the specific certainty that the situation was what the vision showed it to be. Tonight the stone showed him Minas Tirith, as it was tonight. The city, seen from the stone's perspective, carried the specific quality of a place that had been changed by the presence of something that had not been in it before, not physically changed, not structurally. The quality was in the population's movement, in the specific texture of people going about their evening in a city that had been under the weight of approaching war for 3 years, and that had tonight a different quality of weight, not lighter, not yet, but different, the weight of a thing that has been carried alone acquiring a second pair of hands. He saw the Dunédain in the lower circles, settled for the evening in the space the logistics officer had allocated them. He saw the Rohirrim at the Pelinor's western camp. He saw Andúril propped against a wall in the third circle's allocated quarters, which was where it was propped because its owner had taken it off to sleep and had not made an arrangement for it that involved any performance. He sat with the stone for 40 minutes. Then Boromir came. He had known Boromir was coming. He had been told 3 weeks ago that Boromir was alive, and he had received this information with the specific quality of a man whose model of the situation had included Boromir's death as one of its load-bearing assumptions, and who was now being asked to maintain the structure with that assumption removed. He had been told Boromir had knelt at the Council of Elrond. He had been told this by the intelligence officer who had received the report, and he had read the report, and the report's details had been precise, and its source credible, and he had spent 3 weeks deciding what to do with it. Boromir opened the door. He was in good health. He was in better health than the intelligence model of a man who had been traveling from Rivendell to Edoras, to Isengard, to Minas Tirith in the winter, should have produced, and Denethor updated his model for the 3rd time to account for what 6 weeks in the company of Dunédain produced in a man who had always been physically capable. He was in campaign gear. He had not changed for the meeting. Denethor looked at his son. He had prepared the 7 arguments partly for Boromir, had built them on the assumption that Boromir's death had left the stewardship as the sole institutional structure capable of governing Gondor's response, and that the argument for the stewardship's primacy in the succession question was an argument that Boromir, had he lived, would have understood as his father's position and would have engaged with seriously. The arguments were not built for a Boromir who had knelt at Rivendell and risen with the ease of a man who had found his correct position. "You have already decided," Denethor said. Boromir looked at him. He had the specific look of a man who had been expecting a conversation that was going to be difficult, and who had prepared for difficulty, and who was finding that the difficulty was not of the kind he had prepared for. "I decided at the council," Boromir said. "I decided when I heard him name his lineage and recognized that every word of it was true." He paused. "I had 7 arguments against it. They were good arguments." Denethor was quiet. "They stopped being relevant when I understood what I was looking at," Boromir said. "I could have maintained them. They were defensible. I chose not to maintain them." He looked at his father with the specific expression of a man who had spent his life under a father who was never wrong about the things he was wrong about. "The arguments were for a world without him. He is in the world." Denethor looked at his son. He looked at him for a long time. His 7 arguments occupied 7 positions in his mind with the precision that 34 years of careful governance had made the natural arrangement of important considerations. He looked at each of them in sequence, through the light of his son standing alive in the doorway, having knelt at Rivendell and risen with peace on his face. He looked at the stone on its stand across the room, covered now, showing him nothing because he had covered it, and it showed nothing when covered. He said nothing. The arguments were good. They were good arguments for a world in which his son was dead, and the House of Húrin was the last institutional structure capable of governing the South's response. His son was alive. The world was a different world. He said nothing, and Boromir stood in the doorway and did not move, because the conversation had produced something that required time, and because Boromir had become, somewhere on the road between Rivendell and this room, a man who understood when time was what was needed, and who had the patience to give it. The Corsair Admiral's name was Castamir the Younger, which was not his actual name but was what the fleet called him because his actual name was long, and his resemblance to the canonical villain of the same lineage was a coincidence of heritage that the fleet found amusing. And he had stopped, correcting. He had commanded the Umbar Fleet's southern division for 14 years, and the full fleet for 3, and he had, in those 3 years, developed the specific professional confidence of a man whose institutional knowledge exceeded his institutional opposition. The Gondorian river fleet had been a diminished force since the siege of Osgiliath, reduced in tonnage, reduced in experienced crew, reduced in the organizational capacity that aggressive river operations required. He had assessed the Gondorian capability twice annually for 3 years, and each assessment had confirmed the previous one's conclusions: capable of harassment, incapable of engagement at scale, operating at a defensive posture that reflected its resource constraints accurately. His scouts had reported a small Gondorian boat force moving upriver 2 days ago. The count had been 17 vessels, mixed composition, moving at a pace consistent with the current, and a crew complement consistent with reduced manning. He had filed this in the category of harassment operations, a Gondorian attempt to interdict Umbar's supply line to the siege elements at Osgiliath, manageable through standard counter-doctrine. He had adjusted his fleet's position to receive the harassment operation. He had done this at the 3rd hour of the previous evening, which meant his fleet's current disposition had been established for approximately 14 hours, when his watch officer woke him at the 2nd hour of the morning with the specific quality of urgency that watch officers produced, when the situation had developed past the parameters of their standing orders. He came on deck in the dark. His watch officer pointed downstream. He looked. There were lights on the water downstream of his fleet's current position, not the lights of the 17 vessels his scouts had reported, which he had last confirmed upriver, and which should not have been downstream. These were different lights, more numerous, at different heights above the waterline, arranged in the spacing pattern of a fleet that had established its formation before he was aware it was establishing anything. He counted the lights for 40 seconds. He revised his count upward 3 times. He said, "When did they come downstream?" His watch officer said, "They didn't come downstream, Admiral. They assembled. They came from 3 separate tributaries during the night watch and assembled below us." He considered this for 8 seconds. 3 tributaries, he said. "The Eruai, the Sirith, and the Gilrain, sir. Based on the Assembly's current position, they moved into formation approximately 2 hours ago." He looked at the lights again. The fleet below him had an organized quality that 17 vessels of reduced Gondorian capacity did not produce, the specific spacing of a formation that had been placed deliberately rather than accumulated. Each vessel at the distance from its neighbors, that formation doctrine specified, rather than the distance that convenience or darkness produced. He turned to his signals officer. "What is the count?" "Best estimate from current light positions, 40 to 50 vessels, sir. Mixed composition, the larger silhouettes are not Gondorian river barge profile." He had been building his threat model since he came on deck, and the model had been updating with each piece of information. And the model was now at a position he did not find professionally comfortable. He had been positioned to receive a harassment operation. He was looking at a fleet. He called his captains. The captains arrived with the specific expressions of men who had also been watching the lights downstream, and who had their own models that were also at uncomfortable positions. He laid out the situation. He did so in the direct register that the situation required. No management of the information, no framing that reduced the alarm to a manageable level, because the alarm was the accurate response to the situation and manageable levels were for situations that were manageable. Then he laid out the counter-doctrine. The Corsair Fleet's formation doctrine was a specific configuration developed across 400 years of Umbar's naval operations, a configuration that had been tested against every significant naval opponent the fleet had encountered in that time, and had performed effectively against each of them. It relied on 2 structural principles: a concentrated center that anchored the formation's fighting capacity, and flexible flanks that could extend or contract based on the opposition's approach geometry. Both principles had been developed against opponents whose tactical framework was the same as Umbar's. He gave his captains the doctrine and sent them back to their ships. He had not known there was a different tactical framework. This was the specific piece of information he did not have and would not have until the engagement made it available, which was the nature of information about an opponent you had not previously encountered. It arrived during the encounter rather than before it, which was the worst possible timing for information of that category. The Dunédain crewed fleet moved at the 3rd hour of the morning. It moved in the dark, which was the first indication that the framework was different. Corsair doctrine did not operate in darkness at formation scale because darkness removed the visual references that formation coherence required. The fleet below him moved in the dark and maintained formation coherence, which meant it was using a formation coherence system that did not depend on visual reference. He had not encountered this before. It moved toward both flanks simultaneously, which was the second indication, a split approach that his doctrine had no standard counter for, because his doctrine had developed its flanking flexibility against opponents who approached from one axis and adapted to the flanking response, not against opponents who opened with a two-axis approach that treated both flanks as primary rather than supplementary. The first engagement contact came at the eastern flank at the 4th hour. The eastern flank's response was textbook, the standard counter-doctrine for an approaching threat, executed correctly by captains who had run the drill many times, and who executed it now with the professionalism of people doing a thing they had done before. The textbook response was not effective, not because it was executed incorrectly, because the approaching force was not the threat the textbook had been written for. The Númenórean doctrine that the Dunédain fleet was running was the source document from which the Corsair doctrine had derived several of its formation principles, translated and adapted across 400 years of Umbar's independent development. The adaptations had addressed the specific opponents the Corsairs had encountered. They had not addressed the source document's own counter to itself. He understood this at the engagement's 15th minute, standing on his command deck watching his eastern flank's textbook response produce outcomes that differed from the textbook's projections. He said to his operations officer, with the professional neutrality of a man describing an accurate situation, "They know our formation's load-bearing assumptions." His operations officer said, "Sir," he said, "they built the framework we adapted from. They know where the framework's weight is distributed. They are pressing the specific points where our adaptations did not address the original framework's structural requirements." His operations officer was quiet for 7 seconds. "Sir, how do we counter that?" He looked at his eastern flank. He looked at his western flank, where the second engagement contact had developed while he was processing the eastern situation. He said, "We don't have a counter for it in current doctrine." The engagement lasted 40 minutes. He had a full count at the end of it, which was more than he had expected to have, because the force engaging him had not been operating to achieve the maximum possible loss to his fleet, but to achieve the maximum possible position advantage with minimum extended engagement. The force that had engaged him had closed for position, established the position, and then stopped extending the engagement, had held the position and the formation, and had not pressed beyond what the position required. This was also not in his doctrine. His doctrine assumed that an opponent who had achieved position advantage pressed that advantage to maximum outcome. The force that had engaged him had achieved position advantage, and then waited. He understood, when he saw what it was waiting for, which was the signal that came from upriver, the first light of the Pellinnor's defense signals, the specific code that meant the walls had received the army they had been expecting. The fleet had been position holding. The position it was holding was the Anduin's lower reach. The position ensured that his fleet could not move north to reinforce the Osgiliath operation or provide logistical support to any element of the siege. The engagement had not been the point. The position was the point. He looked at the command deck around him, at the officers who had been with him through 14 years of the fleet's southern operations, and he made the assessment that the assessment required. He did not delay it or soften it or arrange it in the sequence that would have made it easier to receive. He had spent 14 years giving his fleet accurate information, and he would give it accurate information now. He sent for the formal surrender protocols. Aragorn was at the lead vessel's bow when the admiral's boat came across. He had come down from the Pellinnor's wall to the river landing at the 3rd hour signal, the signal that confirmed the lower fleet had established position and was holding it, which was the confirmation that the second part of the operation had executed correctly. The Dunédain River fleet had been assembled and crewed in 3 weeks from the vessels available in Gondor's accessible harbors. The crewing had drawn on Dunédain, who had studied Rivendell's preserved Númenórean naval documentation, which was not the same as experienced sailors, but was, it had proven, sufficient for the specific operation the fleet had been assigned. The admiral's boat came alongside. Castamir the Younger was a professional. He came aboard with the bearing of a man who had made a decision he had made correctly given the circumstances, and who was performing the procedure the decision required with the competence that the procedure required, and who was not performing anything else. He was not performing humiliation or performing defiance or performing any of the responses that losing commanders sometimes performed when the loss had been sufficient to destabilize the professional self-assessment. He was performing a formal surrender. He performed it correctly in the language of Númenórean maritime law that the Corsair's own tradition used for formal surrender protocols. The language was specific. the formal quenya of Second-Age naval procedure, which had been preserved in the Corsair tradition because the tradition had developed from Númenórean sources, and the formal procedures of that source had been maintained as the relevant legal framework for surrender engagements. He delivered the formula. Aragorn responded in the same language, with the same accent. The admiral had surrendered to Gondorian admirals before. He had surrendered to Gondorian admirals in this language because the procedure required it, and the Gondorian admirals had managed the formal register with the competence of people who had learned it from documents. He completed the surrender protocol. He stood in the silence that followed the protocol's completion and recalibrated an assumption he had been holding without examining it, which was the assumption that the men of Gondor and the men of the North were the same category of entity at different geographic addresses. They were not. He filed this experience in the professional record he maintained in his memory, with the note that it would require significant time before he had the language for it. He said nothing about it. He would not speak of it for some years. The mouth of Sauron had been preparing the speech for 3 weeks. This was longer than he typically required for a parlay operation. His standard preparation time was 4 days, sufficient to gather the specific intelligence about the opposing commander's psychological profile, identify the 2 or 3 points of maximum leverage that profile indicated, and construct a speech that operated on those points with the precision that 20 years of professional practice had made available. 4 days produced work he was confident in. 3 weeks produced the most sophisticated psychological operation he had assembled in his career. The additional time was warranted by the additional complexity. The intelligence on Aragorn, son of Arathorn, was extensive by the 3rd week of March. 6 months of accumulated reports from the Isengard network, the Bree land intelligence apparatus, the Rohirrim adjacent sources that Dol Guldur maintained for assessment of the West's political condition. The Dunédain campaign had been visible at scale since November and had produced, across its 5 months of operation, more intelligence material than any single opponent had generated in the mouth of Sauron's professional experience. He had read all of it. He had identified the leverage points with the precision that identified leverage points, the ring-bearer's current difficulty, which Sauron's intelligence had established through the specific tracking methods available to the eye, the campaign's cost in men and time, and the specific arithmetic of what the remaining operation would require against mortars retained, capacity. The question of whether a man who had come this far openly, at this scale, with this commitment, had committed to more than the West could sustain. He had assembled the speech from these materials. It was, by his professional assessment, the best work he had produced in 20 years. The Morannon on the 15th of March. The combined force had arrived the previous day, in the specific organized fashion of a force that had been marching for 5 months, and had developed across those months the unconscious coordination that duration produced. The Dunédain formed the center, the Rohirrim the flanks, Gondor's infantry the secondary line. The total count at the Morannon was not what it had been at Sarn Ford. 6 months of campaign had cost what 6 months of campaign always cost, but the count was not the primary characteristic of what stood before the Black Gate. The mouth of Sauron rode out on the 3rd hour of the morning. He had his horse at the correct distance, and his position at the correct height, and his voice at the correct projection for the ground's acoustic properties. He had assessed all of these variables before he rode. The Black Gate's approach was not terrain he had stood on before, but terrain was a variable, like other variables, and he had the professional habit of managing it accurately. He looked at the force assembled before the gate. He made his own assessment of it, because intelligence reports were intelligence reports, and direct observation was direct observation, and the relationship between them required a professional to maintain the distinction. He looked at the Dunédain in the center for 30 seconds. He noted the height, which he had anticipated from the reports. He noted the bearing, which the reports had described, and which direct observation confirmed. He noted the stillness, 2,000 men in formation, at rest, in the specific quality of stillness that men produced when they were fully at ease with where they were and why they were there. He made one revision to his speech before he delivered it. He removed the opening sequence that was designed to introduce uncertainty about the force's position, the sequence that worked on forces whose internal coherence was maintained by confidence in their leadership rather than by the members' individual assessment of the situation. That sequence worked when it worked, because it identified the gap between what the soldiers believed and what the facts were, and exploited the gap. He removed it because he could see, in 30 seconds of direct observation, that the gap was not present. He kept everything else. He delivered the speech. He delivered it in the specific register that 20 years of professional practice had made available. The register in which accurate information was arranged, in the sequence that produced the maximum psychological effect in the audience receiving it. He had sequences for despair, and sequences for doubt, and sequences for the specific erosion of resolve that prolonged difficulty produced in forces held together by the leadership's authority, rather than by the members' individual understanding of the situation's stakes. He had chosen the despair sequence, modified for the leverage points specific to this audience. He delivered it accurately. The information was accurate, the sequencing was correct, the projection was at the correct volume for the ground's acoustic properties. He finished. The force before the black gate was quiet. Not the quiet of people absorbing a speech whose information had produced an effect, the specific active quiet of an audience whose psychological state was being reorganized by the information it had received. That quiet had a texture, a quality of attention that the mouth of Sauron had learned to read across 20 years of producing it. This was a different quiet. He had not produced it. It was the quiet that had been there before he started speaking, and his speaking had passed through it without changing it, the way sound passed through stone without changing stone. He waited for the response. Halbarad was standing at the column's head, 6 feet to Aragorn's left. He had listened to the speech with the professional attention he gave to all intelligence, the attention of a man who was extracting information from a source regardless of the source's intention, because sources had intentions and intelligence had content, and the two were separable with sufficient practice. The speech's content was, the ring-bearer was in difficulty, the campaign's cost was significant, the arithmetic of what remained was unfavorable. He had been aware of all 3 pieces of content before the speech began. He looked at the speech's source, the man on the horse between the gate's towers, in the specific gear of a being who had made the performance of authority his professional instrument, and ran his own assessment of the source's current position, which was the assessment of a ranger who had spent 40 years reading the specific qualities of opponents he was about to engage. The source was performing confidence. Performing was a different thing from being, and the difference was legible when you had been reading the distinction for 40 years. He turned to the column behind him. "Shields up," he said. "Advance at walk." The speech had been the parley operation. The parley operation had produced a 5-word logistics instruction in response. The mouth of Sauron wheeled his horse and returned to the gate, and rode through it, and went to find his operations desk. Because the operations desk was where you went when the parley operation had concluded, and the next operational phase required assessment. He sat at the operations desk and opened the assessment document he maintained for active campaigns. He wrote for 22 minutes. The document contained, in the section marked Psychological Operation Assessment, the following entry. Standard parley operation conducted at Morannon, March 15. Full delivery. Audience. Dunédain led combined force of approximately 6,000 with Dunédain corps of 2,000 in center formation. Standard operation is not effective against this force. Recommend discontinuation of parley approach. He read this back. He had not written that sentence before. He had not written the sentence, "Standard operation is not effective," in 20 years of professional operation, because the standard operation had been effective in 20 years of professional application, with variations in degree rather than in fundamental outcome. He wrote it now because it was accurate, and he had a professional obligation to accurate assessment, regardless of what the assessment was. And 20 years of that obligation had produced in him the specific kind of integrity that was indistinguishable from stubbornness from the outside, but which was, from the inside, simply the refusal to file an inaccurate document. He filed the assessment. The siege ran 9 days. Mordor's attrition doctrine was sound, developed across centuries of engagement with forces whose endurance had a ceiling that the doctrine had been calibrated against. The specific ceiling of mortal men whose physical capacity declined under sustained stress, in the measurable way that physical capacity declined. The doctrine exploited this ceiling through sustained engagement pressure that rotated Mordor's forces, but did not rotate the opposing force, applying continuous pressure until the opposing force's capacity to respond degraded below the threshold required for effective resistance. The Dunedain's relief rotations were precise. The nutrition discipline was maintained at the same standard on day 9 as on day 1. The individual combat capability of the Dunédain Corps on day 9 was measurably similar to day 1 by every assessment his intelligence officers could perform from within the gate's observation positions. The doctrine assumed that 9 days of sustained engagement pressure produced a force operating at diminished capacity. The force operating outside the gate on day 9 was not a diminished version of the force that had arrived on day 1. It was the same force. His intelligence officers filed their day 9 assessment with the professional accuracy of men who understood that their function was to provide accurate information regardless of the accuracy's implications. He read the assessment. He sat with it for 14 minutes. He wrote one line in the margin of the assessment document in the hand he used for notes to himself, rather than formal entries. Their biological clock runs differently. He had no tactical response to this note. He looked at the note for 4 seconds. He closed the document. Outside the gate, the force that had been there for 9 days was still there, in the same formation it had maintained for 9 days, at the same capability level it had maintained for 9 days, waiting with the specific quality of people who had been waiting for a very long time, and for whom 9 more days of waiting was not a variable that changed the relevant calculation. The mouth of Sauron's professional instrument was language. Language required an audience whose psychological state it could act on. The audience outside the gate had a psychological state that his instrument had not been designed for and could not reach. And he understood this with the complete precision of a professional who had spent 20 years understanding what his instrument could and could not do. He filed the 9-day assessment. He made no recommendations. He had no recommendations that were accurate. Aragorn told Halbarad at the 4th hour of the morning of March 25th. He did not gather a council. He did not assemble the command structure and present the plan to the officers who would need to understand it in order to execute their own parts of it correctly. He told Halbarad because Halbarad was the person who needed to know and the person who could manage what needed to be managed in the interval the plan required. And because there was a category of information that was best moved between 2 people rather than through the formal mechanisms of command distribution. He laid it out in the specific register he used for operational briefings, sequence first, rationale second, the variables that were not yet confirmed, at the end, the Orthanc stone, his legitimate claim to it, and what that claim provided, the specific resistance to the eye's domination that a rightful owner operated with through a palantir, which was documented in the records and which he had tested in 3 sessions since Isengard, and which he understood now as a property he could rely on in the way that a man relied on a structural feature he had tested rather than assumed. The confrontation, not a challenge in the military sense, a presentation. The eye had been watching the campaign for 5 months, and had been watching it through the frame of an opponent it expected to approach as opponents had approached it for 3 ages, in the language of secrecy, concealment, the oblique method of beings who knew they were weaker and moved accordingly. He was going to show the eye something it had not been shown, not a threat, the complete, documented, militarily demonstrated proof that the House of Isildur had returned, at full scale, in the open, and was standing at the gate as the legitimate authority of the West presenting its credentials to the ruling power of the East. The eye could not look away from that. The eye had built its entire theory of victory on the assumption that Isildur's heir would come in secret or would not come at all. He was going to make the eye look at how wrong that assumption was in full detail, for as long as he could hold the connection. He told Halbarad the time estimate. 4 hours at minimum. The preparation sessions had established the range, the Palantir connection's sustainability under the eye's full counter-pressure, the specific cost per hour that the sustained will engagement produced, the threshold beyond which the engagement began to cost more than it was returning. He had calculated this with the same precision he had brought to every calculation in the campaign. 4 hours was what the ring-bearer needed. "How will I know when you have it?" Halbarad said. Aragorn looked at him. "The mountain will tell you." He positioned himself at the Moran's edge at the 5th hour. The force was arrayed behind him in the formation it had maintained for 9 days, not the battle formation of a force preparing to assault, but the operational formation of a force that had been here and would continue to be here in the same configuration it had occupied before. He stood at the edge with the stone. He uncovered the palantir. The stone was warm in the specific way it was warm after an active session, residual heat from the connection's maintenance, the material expression of an instrument that had been used recently and retained the warmth of use. He had held it through 3 sessions since Isengard and understood its weight and its specific quality of resistance when the eye pushed through it. He looked into the stone. He showed the eye on Dúril, not raised, the blade at his side in the morning light of March 25th, catching the cold sun with the quality that reforged steel of Telchar's original craft produced when the light was correct. He showed it held, as a king held a sword that was his by every right of lineage and inheritance. The eye registered it. He could feel the registration as a specific quality of focused attention, the eye's perception narrowing to the blade and then expanding to include the context of the blade's holding. He showed it the ring of Barahir, the First Age ring on his right hand, the ring given by Finrod Felagund to Barahir of the First Age, one of the oldest pledged bonds between the houses of men and the Eldar, sealed in the wars of Beleriand when the world was younger, and the cost of alliance between men and elves had been paid in the specific currency of lives given and debts carried across generations. There were beings in the eye's awareness who had been present when that ring was given. The eye's attention changed quality when it registered the ring, a quality of something encountering a depth of record it had not fully accounted for. He showed it the Sceptre of Annúminas. He showed it the assembled force, the full extent of what stood at the Morannon, the Dunédain and the Rohirrim, and the soldiers of Gondor. 2,000 and 4,000 and 6,000 voices of the legitimate West declaring its presence at the gate, as a matter of record rather than petition. He presented. The eye could not look away. Faramir departed the camp at the 3rd hour with 12 rangers. Aragorn had given him the briefing 6 days before the 25th, not the full operational context, which was information that the briefing's recipients needed only in proportion to their function in the operation, but the function specifics. The eastern passes of the Ephel Duath, which the Dunedain's intelligence assets had been mapping since the campaign's 2nd month, from the scout reports of rangers who had operated in Ithilien for 40 years and whose knowledge of the pass's geography was the specific knowledge of people who had been moving through the terrain in all seasons for their entire adult lives. He lost 2 rangers in the crossing, not from combat, from the terrain itself, which was the terrain of Mordor's outer approach in the conditions that the siege had produced, and which required the specific assessment of each step that unfamiliar high ground and poor visibility required. He lost them at the crossing's 3rd section, where the path the scouts had marked narrowed above a drop that the darkness concealed until it was the relevant variable. 2 rangers, 40 and 60 years of service between them, lost to ground rather than to an enemy. He noted their names. He continued. He lost 4 more to the ambush at the approach road's 2nd mile, a patrol he had anticipated from the intelligence and had prepared a counter for, and whose execution of the ambush was 12 seconds faster than the intelligence had projected, which was the kind of discrepancy that cost 4 rangers in 12 seconds. He assessed the discrepancy, updated the model, and continued with 6 rangers and himself at the outer approach to Aradruin. He positioned them in the specific geometry that 6 people at an outer approach position could sustain against the likely response timings, and then he waited, because waiting was what the operation required, and he had spent his professional life learning to wait with the quality of attention that waiting required. The outer approach required holding. He held it. The Palantir session ran 4 hours and 17 minutes before the eye's quality changed. He had been tracking the quality through the connection with the same attention he tracked everything. The specific texture of the eye's focus, the pressure it was applying through the stone, the rate at which the application was costing the eye, against the rate at which it was costing him. He was accounting for his own cost with precision. The sustained will engagement at this level produced in him a specific depletion whose rate he had estimated from the preparation sessions, and whose actual rate was marginally higher than estimated, which he had incorporated into his ongoing calculation at the session's 2nd hour. At 4 hours and 17 minutes, the eye's quality changed. Not toward him. The eye's focus did not increase in his direction, did not press harder against the connection, did not produce the specific intensification he had been expecting when the eye decided to break the connection forcibly rather than continue the engagement. It turned. The eye turned away from the connection, turned in the specific quality of a focus that has registered something that supersedes its current object. The turn had a direction, and the direction was southeast. He held the connection for 10 more minutes, because the connection remaining active was information about what the eye was doing, and information was always useful, and because 10 additional minutes of the eye's attention, split between 2 objects rather than consolidated on one, was 10 minutes that the ring-bearer used. At 4 hours and 27 minutes, the Palantir went dark, not in the way of a stone whose session had been ended by its operator's withdrawal, in the way of a stone that had lost its counterpart. He set the stone down on the stone of the Morannon. His hands were shaking with the specific tremor of sustained muscular engagement past its operational threshold, not from the cold, not from fear, but from 4 hours and 27 minutes of continuous will application at the level the session had required. He had not been aware of the tremor during the session, because the session had required all available attention, and the tremor had been operating below the threshold that available attention was monitoring. He was aware of it now. He did not speak for 6 minutes. Halbarad was 6 feet to his left. He had been 6 feet to Aragorn's left for 4 hours and 27 minutes, in the specific posture of a man who had made a decision at some point in the first hour, probably earlier than that if Aragorn fell he would catch him, and who had maintained that posture without announcement or consultation for the session's full duration. Aragorn looked at the southeast. The mountain was visible from the Morannon, the specific silhouette of Orodruin against the dawn sky, which was different from the sky at the session's beginning. And then the silhouette changed, and it changed in the specific way of a geological event expressing itself at the surface, and the expression was visible from the Morannon, at the distance of the Morannon from Orodruin, and the sound reached them at the interval that the distance required. The mountain told them. The runner reached the Morannon 11 minutes later. He was the fastest ranger in Faramir's team, which was the criterion Faramir had used when he had selected him for the specific function 3 days before the 25th. He ran from the outer approach to Orodruin to the Morannon in 11 minutes, which was not a time that 11 minutes of running that distance should have produced, but he was a ranger, and a ranger running with a message ran at the speed that the message required. He came through the gate's edge to Aragorn. He extended the dispatch. 3 words, in Faramir's hand, in the compressed notation of a man who had learned to say the necessary thing in the minimum space that the necessary thing required. It is done. Aragorn read it. He nodded. He turned to Halbarad. Halbarad was looking at the southeast, where the mountain's expression was still visible in the morning sky. He had been watching it from the moment it began. He had maintained the posture he had held for 4 hours and 27 minutes, the posture of a man who had decided a thing and was maintaining the decision. And now, at the 11-minute mark, he released the posture he had been holding. He had not been aware he was holding it. He exhaled. The exhale was not dramatic, not the theatrical release of a man performing relief for an audience. It was the exhale of a body that had been operating at a sustained tension and had received, through the specific channel of 3 words in a familiar hand, the information that the tension was no longer required. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the exhale had not already said, and Halbarad had spent 40 years learning the difference between the things that required words and the things that did not, and this was not one of the things that required words. The morning was very still. The mountain was still speaking to the southeast, in the specific language of geological events expressing themselves at the surface, in the language that Aragorn had promised Halbarad the mountain would use. The Morannon stood. The force behind it had been there for 9 days, and remained there now, in the same formation, with the same quality of stillness it had maintained, not the stillness of a force waiting for the order to advance, but the stillness of a force that has been waiting for a specific event, and has received confirmation of the event, and is taking the first seconds in which the event is actual, rather than anticipated. Aragorn's hands were no longer shaking. He picked up the palantir. He wrapped it in the cloth. He turned to the force behind him, and the specific business that the next hour required, which was the business of a campaign that had completed its strategic objective, and now had the work of completing its operational conclusion, and which required the same quality of attention that the session had required, and the march had required, and the 6 months of campaign had required. He had been preparing for this work his entire life. He went to do it. Sam Gamgee was in the 4th row from the barrier, and he was not entirely certain how he had gotten there. He had started the morning at the crowd's outer edge, which was where he had been standing when the crowds began to form, and which had seemed like a reasonable position given the specific competition for proximity that 40,000 people attempting to witness one event in one location produced. He had identified the barrier at the courtyard's edge as the relevant destination, and had begun moving toward it with the methodical persistence of a man who grew things for a living, and who understood that the distance between a seed and where it needed to be was a matter of consistent application rather than dramatic effort. He had arrived at the 4th row by the time the proceedings were approaching their main event. He had been helped, he suspected, by the fact that Rangers of the North did not argue with hobbits who indicated, by their direction of travel and their expression, that they needed to be somewhere ahead of where they currently were. The rangers he had passed through had each looked down at him, and each moved without comment, and he had not thanked them because thanking them would have slowed his progress, and the crowd was reforming behind him as he moved. Fourth row. He could see the upper portion of the courtyard from this position, the white stone, which was clean in a way that Minas Tirith had apparently required 6 weeks of Dunédain engineering assistance to achieve, and which was genuinely very clean, the specific clean of stone that had been worked on by people who had a standard, and had applied it. The tree in the center of the upper court was a silver birch of good health, not the white tree, which had been botanically assessed as not viable, a fact that had occasioned a great deal of discussion in the city, and which Sam had his own views on, but kept to himself. And it was catching the morning light in the specific way of a tree that had been well placed in good soil, and knew it. He thought Mr. Bilbo would have had something to say about the tree. He thought about Mr. Bilbo fairly often, and did not spend time on the thought when there were other things requiring attention. The crowd went quiet when Aragorn appeared at the upper court's head. Not immediately. The quiet moved through 40,000 people from the courtyard's center outward, the way quiet moved through any large assembly when the thing the assembly had gathered for arrived and the gathering's social energy reorganized around it. By the time the quiet reached Sam's position at the fourth row, it was the complete quiet that 40,000 people could produce when they chose to produce it, which was a quiet that had more weight than silence, because it was chosen. He came down the levels. Sam watched him descend through the city's levels with the Dunédain arrayed on either side in the loose ceremonial formation they had adopted for this, not the operational formation of the march, which had been the working formation of a force doing work, but the formal arrangement of a guard performing the specific function of a guard at the moment of highest significance. Each ranger at exactly the height Sam had spent 6 months adjusting his eye to, each one taller than the tallest man he had known before the campaign began, each one carrying the quiet authority of the 80-year veteran, in the specific posture of someone who had arrived at the thing they had been moving toward their whole life. And Durrell caught the sun at the second level. Sam had seen it catch the sun before. He had seen it catch the sun in the Pelinor's morning light, and at the Morannon in the winter cold, and in Isengard's ruins, and he had developed across those sightings the practitioner's understanding of what good steel and correct light produced, which was a specific quality of announcement that required no supplement. He watched Aragorn reach the courtyard's level. He carried the Sceptre of Annúminas at his belt, not raised, the scepter of the kings of the north, which had rested in Rivendell for 1,000 years, and had been raised once at the Council of Elrond in October, and was now being carried to the place where the raising's consequences had arrived. The ring of Barahir on his right hand, on Durrell at his left hip. He was not in coronation dress. He was in campaign gear. Sam had heard this debated in the recovery wards over the past 3 weeks, and had not contributed to the debate, and had noted privately that the man who had spent 87 years preparing for this day was going to wear what he was going to wear, and the debate was academic. Faramir stood at the courtyard's center with the crown. The formalities were performed with the precision of a man who had studied the relevant texts, confirmed the relevant citations, and was executing the procedure correctly on the first occasion it had been executed in a very long time. Sam followed the formal portion of the proceedings with the attention he gave to things he needed to understand rather than simply observe, which was slightly different from the attention he gave things he only needed to observe. Aragorn took the crown from Faramir's hands. He held it. He held it for 3 seconds, which Sam counted because Sam counted things that required counting, and this was a thing that required counting because the 3 seconds were the 3 seconds before the sentence that was going to be the first sentence of the Fourth Age. Aragorn said, rello enderena utulien, sino maruvan ar hildinyar ten ambar meta. Sam did not understand a word of it. He understood that the words were Quenya. He knew enough of the landscape of languages to place the sound, and he understood from 6 months of proximity to people who treated old things with the seriousness they deserved, that these were very old words being said in the place they had been building toward. He understood from the quality of the silence that followed them that 40,000 people had heard something that required silence afterward. Then Aragorn spoke again, in the common speech, in the register of a man who had arrived at the end of a very long road, and was taking the last step of it in full view of everyone who had walked any part of it with him. "By the labor of many I have come into my inheritance," he said. "Let Mithrandir set the crown upon my head if he will, for he has been the mover of all that has been accomplished, and this is his victory as much as any man's." Sam had not seen the old man until that moment. He was there at the courtyard's edge, in his white, the staff in his left hand, and Sam understood from the specific quality of the silence that opened around him as he stepped forward that 40,000 people had been aware of him in the way you were aware of something that had always been present and which only became visible when it moved. He walked to Aragorn without ceremony, not slowly, with the pace of a man who understood what the moment required and was providing exactly that, neither more nor less. He took the crown. He held it above Aragorn's head with both hands, and he looked at the man kneeling before him on the white stone of the courtyard. And Sam could not see his expression from the fourth row, but he knew the right thing when he felt it moving through 40,000 people in the specific way that right things move through large assemblies when they were done correctly. He placed the crown on his head. He knew the right thing the way he knew good soil when he put his hand in it, not from analysis, but from the accumulated knowledge of a person who had been paying attention to the right things for his whole life, and who could recognize rightness by the specific quality it produced in the world around it. The crown was placed, and the fourth age had a king, and the proceedings moved into the portions that Sam had less direct stake in, and he stood in the fourth row and watched and noted the city's quality, the full, clean, morning quality of a place that had been under one kind of weight for 3 years, and had exchanged it for a different kind of weight, and was in the specific first hours of understanding the difference. He pushed back through the crowd at the proceedings' conclusion. The crowd was reforming from the assembly's end into the movement of 40,000 people who had attended the same event and were now individually returning to whatever came next. He moved through it with the same methodical persistence that had gotten him to the fourth row, going in the opposite direction, toward the houses of healing, where Frodo was in the recovery he needed, and where Sam had left his morning's first direction in order to be at the fourth row for the proceedings. He passed through the outer circle at the city's base level. The Dunédain were there. They were arrayed in the formation they had maintained for the proceedings, the 2,000 in the loose ceremonial arrangement, each one in the position the arrangement required, each one carrying the bearing of a completed thing rather than an ongoing thing. The campaign was done. The war was done. The specific quality of people who had been moving toward a destination and had arrived was present in the formation the way completion was present in finished work. Not the tension of something in progress, but the quality of something that had found its shape. He walked toward the formation's edge, looking for the gap that would take him to the road toward the houses of healing. He found it between 2 rangers. He stopped. He looked up at the one on his left, a man of approximately 50 years of apparent age, which Sam understood by now meant something significantly older than 50 in the way of a Dúnedain Ranger's biological relationship to time, which meant decades of the kind of field work that left specific marks on a person's bearing, without leaving conventional marks on their face. He looked up at the one on his right. Approximately the same bearing, the same quality of a man who was exactly what he appeared to be and had been exactly that for long enough that being it had become effortless. Both rangers were looking forward. Sam said, "Excuse me." Both rangers looked down. Both of them considered the 4-foot hobbit standing at the gap between them, who had walked to Mount Doom and back, and who did not particularly need anything from them, except the 3 feet of passage that the gap contained, and who was waiting with the patient expectation of a man who knew that the gap was a gap, and that gaps were for passing through. Both rangers stepped aside. Sam Gamgee walked through the gap between the rangers of the north on the first morning of the fourth age, in the direction of the houses of healing, without ceremony and without acknowledgement, and without any quality that suggested he found the passage remarkable. Neither ranger had anything to add. They returned to their positions and looked forward again, as they had been looking forward, in the formation they had been holding, on the morning that the thing they had been holding toward their whole lives had become the morning they were standing in. The city of Minas Tirith went about its first business of the new age, in the specific way that cities went about their business, with the ordinary momentum of living things resuming the work of being alive, after a long period in which the work had been survival rather than living. The roads were open. The markets were filling. The great tower at the city's peak caught the morning sun and returned it to the valley below in the way that well-placed stone returned light when the light was correct. In the houses of healing, Sam found Frodo awake, and in the morning light and looking at his hand where the ring had been. And Sam sat beside him and did not say anything for a while, because some things required presence rather than language, and he had always known the difference. The fourth age had begun, as all ages began, not with the sound of the last age ending, but with the sound of people who were still alive beginning to do what came next. The end.